The morning mist still clung to the pastures when 20-year-old Jody Loomis vanished on Snohomish County's quiet backroads on August 23, 1972. She'd kissed her parents goodbye at 7:15 a.m., pedaling toward the stables she adored. By noon, friends grew anxious. By afternoon, panic set in, and at 6:23 p.m., a farmer found her body in nearby woods, sexually assaulted and shot in the head. The shocking violence shattered a community that thought it was safe, where doors stayed unlocked and children roamed free until dark. For 47 years, her killer lived among them, smiling at neighbors, buying groceries, blending in, while fear lingered like a shadow. Then, in 2019, DNA evidence identified Terrence Miller as Jody's murderer. The arrest stunned the town and left one haunting question: how long had evil been hiding in plain sight? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced the pre-dawn quiet of the Loomis farmhouse at 6 a.m. sharp on August 23, 1972. But Jody was already awake, her blue eyes bright with anticipation, as she gazed out her bedroom window at the misty fields that stretched toward the distant Cascade Mountains. Today promised to be perfect. Clear skies, warm temperatures, and hours spent with the horses she adored at Sunset Stables. "Morning, sweetheart," her mother called from the kitchen as Jody bounded down the creaking wooden stairs, her riding boots clicking against each step. The familiar sense of bacon and coffee filled the cozy farmhouse, a ritual as dependable as sunrise itself. "Can't wait to get to the stables," Jody said, grabbing a piece of toast and kissing her father's weathered cheek. Mr. Loomis looked up from his morning paper, the same gentle smile that had greeted her every morning for 20 years. "Be careful on those back roads," he said, though his tone held no real worry. Crime was something that happened in Seattle, not here in their peaceful corner of Snohomish County, where everybody knew everybody and trouble rarely ventured beyond the occasional teenager's prank. Jody checked her saddlebag one final time: water bottle, apple for her favorite mare, and the worn leather gloves she'd received for her birthday. Her bicycle waited patiently by the front porch, its blue frame gleaming despite years of faithful service on rural roads. "I'll be home by dinner," she called, pedaling down the gravel driveway as her parents waved from the kitchen window. The morning sun painted everything in shades of gold: the wheat fields, the weathered fence posts, and Jody herself as she disappeared around the bend toward what should have been another perfect day. Neither parent could have imagined they had just witnessed their daughter's final moments of freedom. The county road stretched like ribbons through Snohomish County's pastoral landscape, flanked by split-rail fences and clusters of Douglas fir that had stood sentinel for decades. Jody pedaled with easy confidence along the familiar route, her blonde hair streaming behind her like a banner of youth and vitality. Mrs. Peterson, hanging laundry in her front yard, paused to wave as Jody passed. "Beautiful morning," she called out, and Jody's cheerful response carried back on the warm air. At the Hendersons' dairy farm, old Buck Henderson raised his hand in greeting from beside the barn, his weathered face creasing into a smile at the sight of the young woman who never failed to brighten his mornings with her passing. The road wound gently through stands of timber and open meadows where cattle grazed peacefully in the summer heat. Jody knew every landmark by heart: the lightning-struck oak that marked the halfway point, the red mailbox where the Johnsons lived, the small wooden bridge over Willow Creek where she sometimes stopped to rest on particularly hot days. But today she was eager to reach the stables, to spend precious hours with the horses that had captured her heart since childhood. The gentle giants understood her in ways that words never could, their warm brown eyes reflecting a wisdom that spoke directly to her soul. As she approached the wooded section where tall evergreens created a natural tunnel, Jody felt the familiar thrill of anticipation. Soon she would be brushing down her favorite mare, feeling the powerful muscles beneath the silky coat, experiencing that perfect connection between human and animal that made all of life's small troubles disappear. The shadows swallowed her bicycle whole as she entered the tree line, the last witness to her passage being a red-winged blackbird that watched from its perch on a fence post as the young woman vanished into the green darkness. At Sunset Stables, the old grandfather clock in the tack room chimed 11:30. Its brass pendulum marking time with mechanical precision. Sarah Mitchell glanced up from brushing her horse, a frown creasing her brow. "Jody should have arrived an hour ago. Have you seen Jody yet?" she asked Tom Bradley, who was adjusting his saddle nearby. Tom shook his head, his own expression showing the first hints of concern. "She's never late," Sarah murmured, more to herself than to Tom. In the 3 years she'd known Jody Loomis, the young woman had never missed a riding session, never arrived without calling if she was delayed. Punctuality was as much a part of Jody's character as her infectious laugh and her gentle way with the most skittish horses. The other riders began to notice the absence too. By noon, when the sun stood directly overhead, and the stable hands were preparing for the busy afternoon session, Jody's absence had become a topic of whispered conversation among the regular riders. "Maybe her bike broke down," suggested Jenny Walsh, though the uncertainty in her voice betrayed her own growing worry. The county roads could be treacherous for cyclists, gravel surfaces that could send a bicycle sliding, blind curves where cars might not see a rider in time. At 1 o'clock, Sarah could no longer ignore the knot of anxiety growing in her stomach. She walked to the stable office where Mrs. Garrett kept the telephone, her boots echoing hollowly on the wooden floor. "Mrs. Loomis?" Sarah said when the familiar voice answered. "This is Sarah Mitchell from the stables. I was wondering if Jody was feeling all right today. She hasn't arrived yet, and that's just not like her." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several heartbeats before Mrs. Loomis spoke, her voice tight with sudden alarm. "But she left for the stables hours ago." The Snohomish County Sheriff's Department received the missing person report at 3:47 p.m., logged by Deputy Ron Matthews, who had been answering routine calls about loose cattle and minor traffic violations. When Mr. Loomis's voice came through the radio, tight with barely controlled panic, Matthews immediately understood that this was different. "My daughter left for the stables this morning at 7:15, Mr. Loomis explained, his words coming in rapid bursts. "She never arrived. 20 years old, blonde hair, riding a blue bicycle. She knows these roads like the back of her hand." Within minutes, the word had spread through the close-knit community like wildfire. Neighbors emerged from their homes, abandoning afternoon chores to join the search. Mrs. Peterson called her husband home from the fields. The Henderson boys left their cattle and grabbed flashlights from the barn. Even elderly Mrs. Johnson, who rarely left her house anymore, stood vigil by her front window, watching the road for any sign of the missing girl. Search parties formed spontaneously, spreading out along the network of county roads that connected the Loomis farm to Sunset Stables. Mr. Loomis led one group in his pickup truck, retracing the route Jody should have taken, stopping every few hundred yards to call her name into the gathering dusk. Deputy Matthews coordinated the search from his patrol car, his radio crackling with reports from volunteers who had found nothing. No sign of Jody, no abandoned bicycle, no clue to explain her disappearance. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, the searchers' calls grew more desperate. "Jody! Jody Loomis!" The voices echoed across the empty fields, bouncing off barn walls and disappearing into the vast silence of the countryside. But the only responses came from the evening birds settling into their roosts, their songs a mournful counterpoint to human anguish. The crime scene tape fluttered in the evening breeze like yellow prayer flags, marking the spot where innocence had died and evil had briefly revealed its face. At 6:23 p.m., Farmer Bill Henderson had been checking his back fence line when he saw something that didn't belong among the Douglas fir and salmonberry bushes. Jody's body lay partially hidden beneath a fallen log, her bright riding clothes a shocking splash of color against the dark earth. Henderson's weathered hands shook as he backed away from the scene, his mind struggling to process what his eyes had seen. The phone call to the sheriff's department came in gasping, broken phrases. "Found her. Oh God, she's dead. Those woods behind my north pasture." Sheriff Tom Watson arrived first, his patrol car kicking up clouds of dust as he raced down the farm road. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his career. Jody had been sexually assaulted and shot once in the head, execution style. Her bicycle lay 20 feet away, thrown carelessly into the underbrush, as if it meant nothing, though it had carried her faithfully for years. The scene spoke of calculated violence, of a predator who had waited and planned. This was no crime of passion, no random act by a drifter passing through. Someone had known Jody's routine, had known she would pass this way, had been waiting. As the first detectives arrived and began processing the scene, Sheriff Watson drove the most difficult miles of his life to the Loomis farmhouse. He found Mr. and Mrs. Loomis standing in their kitchen, surrounded by neighbors who had come to offer support, their faces still holding on to hope. The hope died the moment they saw Watson's expression. Mrs. Loomis's legs gave out, and she would have fallen if her husband hadn't caught her. The sound that emerged from her throat was something beyond crying, beyond screaming. It was the sound of a mother's world ending. "She's gone," Watson said simply, because sometimes the truth demands simplicity. "I'm sorry, she's gone." Detective Frank Morrison's notebook filled rapidly with names, times, and fragments of information that seemed to lead everywhere and nowhere. The investigation launched with the intensity of a military operation. Every available deputy called in to canvass the county for witnesses, clues, anything that might point toward Jody's killer. The command post established itself in the Loomis family's kitchen, where neighbors brought coffee and sandwiches to fuel the searchers, while Mrs. Loomis sat at her dining room table, staring at photographs of her daughter, as if she could will them to life. Mr. Loomis paced constantly, unable to sit still, asking the same questions over and over. Who would do this? Who could do this to our girl? Roadblocks appeared at every major intersection, deputies stopping cars and questioning drivers about their whereabouts on August 23rd. The phone rang constantly with tips, suspicious characters seen in the area, arguments overheard, vehicles that didn't belong. Each lead demanded investigation. Each required precious hours that seemed to slip away like sand. Morrison interviewed everyone who had seen Jody that morning. Mrs. Peterson remembered her cheerful wave. Buck Henderson recalled her bright smile as she passed the dairy farm. But between the Henderson place and the wooded area where she died, Jody had seemingly vanished from human observation. The forensics team processed the crime scene with painstaking care, collecting evidence that might someday point to the killer. In 1972, DNA analysis was science fiction, but Morrison carefully cataloged every fiber, every footprint, every potential clue, hoping that someday technology might catch up to his determination. Days blended into weeks as the investigation consumed Morrison's life. He slept in the office more often than at home, surviving on coffee and determination, driven by the memory of Mrs. Loomis's shattered face and the promise he'd made to find her daughter's killer. But the leads kept dying, one by one, until Morrison found himself staring at a wall covered with dead ends and wondering if justice would ever come to Jody Loomis. The funeral program, printed on cream-colored paper with Jody's smiling photograph on the cover, became a memento of shattered innocence for a community that would never feel safe again. The First Methodist Church of Snohomish hadn't seen a crowd like this since its founding. Over 400 people packed into pews designed for half that number, with mourners standing along the walls and spilling out into the churchyard. Jody's casket, covered in white roses and baby's breath, sat at the front of the sanctuary like an accusation against the world's cruelty. Her parents sat in the front pew, supported by family and friends, their faces etched with a grief so profound it seemed to change the very air around them. Pastor Williams struggled through his remarks, his usually strong voice breaking as he spoke about a young life cut short, about faith tested by incomprehensible loss. The hymns felt hollow, the prayers seemed to echo back unanswered from the vaulted ceiling. But it was the community's response that truly revealed how deeply Jody's death had wounded them all. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolt locks within a week. Parents who had once allowed their children to roam freely now kept them close, watching anxiously from windows and calling them inside before dark. Conversations changed throughout Snohomish County. Neighbors eyed each other with new suspicion, wondering if the friendly face across the fence might hide something darker. Trust, once given freely in this rural community, became a precious commodity to be carefully guarded. The killer walked among them. Everyone knew that. He might be someone they saw at church on Sunday, someone who helped load groceries at the market, someone who waved from his front porch as they drove by. The randomness of it, the terrible possibility that evil could wear such an ordinary mask, transformed every interaction into a potential threat. As dirt fell on Jody's casket, Mrs. Loomis clutched a single white rose, her final gift to the daughter who would never come home again. The evidence box sat on the shelf like a monument to failure, its manila folders thick with witness statements that led nowhere, photographs that revealed nothing, and forensic reports that offered no answers. Detective Morrison's neat handwriting filled report after report. Investigation continuing. No new leads. Case remains open. Summer turned to autumn, autumn to winter, and still the killer remained free. Morrison worked other cases because he had to, but Jody's file never left his desk. During quiet moments, he would open it again, reading through the same statements, hoping to find some detail he had missed, some connection that would break the case wide open. The Loomis family tried to rebuild their lives around the gaping hole Jody's absence had created. Mrs. Loomis returned to her job at the county assessor's office, moving through her days like a sleepwalker, performing her duties with mechanical precision while her heart remained buried in the cemetery. Mr. Loomis threw himself into farm work, rising before dawn and falling into bed exhausted, hoping that physical labor might quiet the voices in his head that whispered about justice denied. The community slowly began to exhale, though the tension never fully left. New locks remained on doors that had once stood open. Children still came home before dark, but life demanded that people move forward, that they function despite their fears. Morrison felt the weight of every passing day. Each sunset that fell without an arrest was another victory for the killer, another day that justice remained elusive. He had promised the Loomis family that he would find their daughter's murderer, a promise that felt heavier with each failure. On a cold December evening, Morrison carefully placed Jody's file in the evidence box and carried it to the storage room. The case remained open, but resources had to be allocated elsewhere. The box joined hundreds of others on metal shelving, waiting for a miracle that might never come. The holiday table stretched through the Loomis dining room, set for family members who gathered every Thanksgiving, despite the empty chair that served as a constant reminder of loss. Loomis had insisted on maintaining the tradition, though the laughter that once filled their farmhouse during holidays had been replaced by careful conversations that danced around the grief they all carried. Years had passed since August 23, 1972, each marking anniversary bringing fresh waves of sorrow and frustration. The case files had grown thin as detectives retired and new ones took their places, each promising to review the evidence with fresh eyes, each eventually moving on to crimes that seemed more solvable. Mr. Loomis had aged a decade in the 5 years since Jody's death, his hair gone completely gray, his shoulders stooped as if carrying an invisible weight. He spoke less now, spending long hours in his workshop, building furniture with the same methodical precision he had once used to search for his daughter's killer. Mrs. Loomis had found solace in volunteering at the hospital, spending her free time with patients who needed comfort. Some said she was searching for meaning in her suffering, trying to transform her pain into something that might help others. The work gave her purpose, but it couldn't fill the void Jody had left behind. Jody's sister, now 25 and married, visited regularly with her own children, bringing life back into the farmhouse for brief, precious moments. But even the grandchildren couldn't fully dispel the shadow that hung over family gatherings. Detective Morrison, now graying at the temples, occasionally stopped by with updates that weren't really updates, new theories explored and discarded, old evidence re-examined without revelation. He had become more than an investigator to the family. He was a keeper of their hope, even when that hope seemed increasingly fragile. The empty chair remained at every meal, a place setting for a daughter who would never grow old, never marry, never bring grandchildren home for the holidays. The new detective's badge still gleamed with fresh polish when Detective Lisa Chen first encountered the Loomis case file in the basement storage room of the Snohomish County Sheriff's Department. It was 1994, and Chen had just transferred from the Seattle Police Department, eager to make her mark in a smaller jurisdiction where she hoped cases didn't disappear quite so easily into bureaucratic chaos. The evidence box caught her attention during a routine inventory. Its yellowed label marked Loomis, Jody, Homicide 1972. Chen had heard whispers about the case from older deputies. The young woman murdered on her way to the stables, the investigation that had consumed years without producing an arrest, the family still waiting for justice after more than 2 decades. Late that evening, after her shift had officially ended, Chen spread the file contents across her desk. The crime scene photographs, faded but still shocking, showed a young woman whose life had been brutally cut short. The witness statements revealed a community's desperate attempts to help, while the forensic reports demonstrated the limitations of 1,970S investigative technology. Chen read every page, absorbed every detail, trying to understand why this case had gone cold when others from the same era had been solved. The physical evidence was minimal: some fibers, footprint casts that had degraded over time, and biological samples that had been tested with the limited methods available 2 decades earlier. But what struck Chen most was Detective Morrison's final report, written in careful longhand. All leads exhausted. Case remains open, pending new evidence or witnesses. The words carried the weight of a man who had given everything to a case that had given nothing back. Chen closed the file as midnight approached, but she knew she would return to it. Something about Jody Loomis, her bright smile in the photographs, her family's enduring grief, the killer who had walked free for 22 years had gotten under her skin. The case was cold, but it wasn't dead. Not yet. The gravestone bore simple words etched in black granite: Jody Loomis, beloved daughter, 1952-1972. Detective Morrison knelt beside it on a gray October morning in 2001, his knees protesting against the damp earth as he placed fresh flowers among the others that marked this holy ground. Retirement had been kind to Morrison in most ways: more time with his wife, grandchildren who climbed on his lap demanding stories, fishing trips to the high lakes of the Cascades. But Jody's case remained an open wound, the one investigation that had defeated him despite years of tireless effort. "I'm sorry, kiddo," he whispered to the gravestone, words that had become a ritual during his monthly visits. "I'm sorry we couldn't get him." The technology existed now to solve cases like Jody's. DNA analysis had revolutionized criminal investigation. Cold cases from the 1970S and 1980S were being cracked regularly. But somehow Jody's evidence had been overlooked in the rush to process more recent crimes, her case file gathering dust while families with better connections or more media attention saw their loved ones' cases prioritized. Morrison had tried to advocate for renewed investigation, but budget constraints and personnel shortages meant that unsolved murders from 30 years ago received little attention unless they generated public pressure. The Loomis family had grieved quietly, without the media campaigns that sometimes forced action on cold cases. The detective stood slowly, his joints reminding him that he was no longer the young investigator who had first responded to a farmer's horrified phone call. The killer might be dead by now. 30 years was a long time, and evil men died like everyone else. But Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in Snohomish County, a murderer was living peacefully, secure in the knowledge that he had gotten away with the perfect crime. The morning mist began to lift as Morrison walked back to his car, leaving Jody alone with her memories and secrets. The DNA test kit arrived at the Snohomish County Sheriff's Department in March 2010, part of a federal grant program designed to help smaller jurisdictions process cold case evidence using modern forensic technology. Detective Sarah Walsh, Chen's successor after her promotion to sergeant, saw an opportunity to finally give families like the Loomises the answers they deserved. The evidence storage room had been reorganized twice since Morrison's retirement, but the Loomis box remained exactly where he had placed it nearly 4 decades earlier. Walsh handled the contents with careful reverence, understanding that these faded photographs and yellowed reports represented someone's daughter, someone's shattered world. The biological evidence that had seemed so promising in 1972 looked pitifully small by 2010 standards. A few stained fabric samples, some dried material that might contain DNA if they were lucky, but advances in forensic science had made the impossible routine. Technicians could now extract genetic profiles from evidence that previous generations of investigators would have considered worthless. Dr. Amanda Foster, the forensic scientist who processed Jodie's evidence, had worked hundreds of cold cases, but something about this one touched her deeply. Maybe it was the victim's age, or the family's decades of waiting, or the simple tragedy of a young woman who had been murdered for no reason beyond being in the wrong place when evil came calling. The DNA extraction process took weeks, complicated by the age and degradation of the samples. Foster worked methodically, using every technique at her disposal to coax genetic information from evidence that had spent decades in storage boxes, subjected to temperature fluctuations and humidity that could destroy the very molecules that might identify a killer. When the results finally came back, Foster stared at her computer screen in amazement. They had recovered a partial DNA profile, not complete but usable. For the first time in 38 years, science had given investigators a real lead in the murder of Jody Loomis. The family tree chart covered an entire wall of the police department's conference room, a sprawling genealogical web that traced DNA connections back through generations of American families. Forensic genealogist Maria Santos had been working on the Loomis case for 6 months, using public databases and genetic analysis to narrow down potential suspects from thousands to hundreds to dozens. The DNA profile recovered from Jodie's evidence didn't match anything in CODIS, the National Criminal Database, which meant the killer had never been arrested for a felony requiring DNA submission. But genetic genealogy offered another path. By comparing the crime scene DNA to profiles voluntarily submitted to genealogy websites, investigators could identify relatives of the perpetrator and work backward to find him. Santos had built family trees for dozens of potential suspects, tracking birth certificates, marriage licenses, and death records through county courthouses and online databases. The work was painstaking and methodical, requiring the patience of a scholar and the instincts of a detective. Each genetic connection told a story: migrations from the East Coast to the Pacific Northwest, families that scattered across states and generations, genetic markers that persisted through time like breadcrumbs leading back to a single source. Santos followed these molecular trails with the dedication of a bloodhound, understanding that somewhere in the tangle of human relationships lay the identity of a killer. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning in September 2018, when a newly uploaded DNA profile showed a close genetic relationship to the crime scene sample. The profile belonged to a woman in her 50s who had submitted her DNA out of curiosity about her ancestry, never imagining she might help solve a decades-old murder. Santos worked backward from this genetic cousin, building family trees that stretched across 3 generations. Birth records from the 1940s led to marriage certificates from the 1960s, which pointed to families that had lived in Snohomish County during the early 1970s. The net was tightening, the possibilities narrowing to a handful of men who had been the right age and in the right place when Jody Loomis died. One name appeared repeatedly in the genealogical research: Terren Miller, born in 1942, a lifelong resident of Snohomish County who had been 30 years old in 1972. Miller had no criminal record, no history that would have made him a suspect in the original investigation. He was by all appearances exactly the kind of quiet, ordinary citizen who could hide in plain sight. Detective Walsh stared at Miller's name on the family tree chart, feeling the electric thrill that came when a cold case suddenly turned hot. After 46 years, they finally had a suspect. Terrence Miller's house sat on a quiet residential street, like thousands of others throughout suburban America. A modest ranch-style home with a well-maintained lawn, flower beds that suggested someone cared about appearances, and a mailbox painted in cheerful blue letters that spelled out "The Millers." Detective Walsh drove past slowly, studying the property where a suspected killer had lived peacefully for decades. The house revealed nothing sinister, no external clues that might have marked its owner as anything other than an ordinary retiree. The driveway held a 15-year-old sedan, washed and waxed despite its age. Garden tools hung neatly in the open garage, and the American flag flew from a pole beside the front steps. It was, Walsh reflected grimly, exactly the kind of normal facade that allowed monsters to hide in plain sight. Miller himself, when Walsh finally glimpsed glimpsed him through surveillance photographs, looked like anybody's grandfather. At 77, he was a small, thin man who walked with careful steps and wore the kind of practical clothing favored by men of his generation: polyester slacks, button-down shirts, shoes that prioritized comfort over style. His thinning gray hair was always combed neatly, his face clean-shaven and unremarkable. The surveillance team learned Miller's routines quickly: grocery shopping on Tuesday mornings, library visits on Thursday afternoons, occasional coffee at the diner downtown where he sat alone and read the newspaper. He attended First Baptist Church every Sunday, arriving early and sitting in the same pew, exchanging pleasant greetings with fellow congregants who had known him for years. None of them suspected that the quiet widower who sometimes helped with church maintenance might be the same man who had brutally murdered Jody Loomis when they were all young and the world seemed safer. Miller had constructed a life of such studied normalcy that even trained investigators found it difficult to reconcile his mundane existence with the savagery of the crime scene photographs. But DNA doesn't lie, and genetic markers don't care about appearances. Somewhere behind Miller's grandfather facade lurked the predator who had waited in the woods for an innocent young woman to ride into his trap. The discarded coffee cup sat in the dumpster behind Murphy's Diner like a gift from the surveillance gods, its white ceramic surface bearing the invisible traces that would finally confirm what science already suspected. Detective Walsh watched through binoculars as Terrence Miller finished his Tuesday morning breakfast, left his usual dollar tip, and walked to his car without ever imagining that his DNA was about to seal his fate. 3 weeks of careful surveillance had led to this moment. The investigation team had followed Miller through his predictable routines, documenting his movements while waiting for the perfect opportunity to obtain a DNA sample without alerting him to their interest. A discarded tissue, a used utensil, even saliva on a cigarette butt, any of these would have sufficed, but Miller's careful habits made such evidence difficult to obtain. The coffee cup represented a breakthrough in more ways than one. Miller always drank from ceramic mugs at the diner, always finished every drop, and always let the waitress clear his table. But this particular Tuesday morning, he had seemed distracted, leaving half his coffee unfinished when his phone rang with what appeared to be an urgent call. Detective Walsh waited until Miller's sedan disappeared around the corner before approaching the dumpster with evidence collection kit in hand. The cup went into a sterile container, then into a cooler packed with ice, then into her patrol car for the fastest possible trip to the State Forensic Laboratory. Dr. Foster processed the sample personally, understanding the significance of what they were attempting. After 47 years, this coffee cup represented the Loomis family's best hope for answers, the investigators' best chance for justice, and science's opportunity to prove that some crimes can never truly be forgotten. The DNA extraction took 2 days. The comparison with the crime scene profile took another day, but when Foster finally called Detective Walsh with the results, her voice carried the excitement of someone who had just helped solve one of the county's oldest mysteries. "It's a match," Foster said simply. "Terrence Miller killed Jody Loomis." The handcuffs clicked shut around Terrence Miller's thin wrists with a sound that echoed through 47 years of waiting. Detective Walsh read him his rights in the living room, where Miller had watched television, eaten quiet dinners, and lived a life of carefully constructed normalcy, while Jody Loomis lay cold in her grave. Miller's arrest came at dawn on September 12, 2019, executed with the precision of a military operation designed to minimize the chance of escape or evidence destruction. Walsh knocked firmly on the front door while backup units positioned themselves around the house, though the 77-year-old suspect posed little physical threat to anyone. When Miller answered the door, still in his bathrobe and slippers, Walsh saw no recognition in his eyes, no flash of guilt or fear. He listened quietly as she explained why she was there, his expression never changing from mild confusion to anything approaching acknowledgement. "I think there's been some mistake," Miller said calmly, though his hands trembled slightly as Walsh secured the handcuffs. "I don't know anything about any murder." Neighbors emerged from their houses as the patrol cars filled the quiet street, drawn by the flashing lights and commotion that had shattered their morning routine. Mrs. Patterson, who had lived next door to Miller for 15 years, stood on her front porch in shocked disbelief, watching as the man who had helped her carry groceries and shoveled her sidewalk after snowstorms was led away in restraints. The local news crews arrived within hours, turning Miller's modest neighborhood into a media circus. Camera crews set up on the sidewalk, while reporters interviewed anyone willing to share their memories of the man they had known as a quiet, helpful neighbor who kept to himself but always had a kind word for children and a willingness to lend tools to anyone who needed them. By evening, the story had spread beyond Snohomish County. After nearly half a century, the murder of Jody Loomis was front-page news again, but this time, the headlines carried hope instead of despair. DNA evidence leads to arrest in 1972 cold case murder. The legal brief spread across prosecutor Janet Morris's desk told the story of a case that spanned 5 decades, its pages thick with evidence reports, witness statements, and scientific analyses that would have been impossible to imagine when Jody Loomis first disappeared on that summer morning in 1972. Morris had prosecuted hundreds of cases, but none carried the weight of this one. The hopes of a grieving family, the reputation of a justice system that had failed them for 47 years, and the knowledge that this might be their only chance to hold a killer accountable. The evidence against Terrence Miller was both overwhelming and frustratingly limited. The DNA match was conclusive. Statistical analysis showed less than 1 chance in several billion that the biological material found at the crime scene had come from anyone other than Miller. Genetic genealogy had provided an unbroken chain of scientific proof linking the defendant to Jody's murder. But the case also highlighted the challenges of prosecuting crimes from a different era. Most of the original investigators had died or retired, taking with them decades of institutional knowledge about the case. Physical evidence had degraded over time, witness memories had faded, and the crime scene itself had been developed into a subdivision where families now lived peacefully, unaware that their quiet neighborhood had once been marked by violence. Morse worked methodically through the case files, identifying which elements of the original investigation could still be useful in court. The crime scene photographs, though faded, still showed the brutality of Jody's death. The forensic reports, while primitive by modern standards, documented the collection and preservation of evidence that had ultimately identified her killer. The prosecutor also had to consider Miller's age and health. At 77, the defendant appeared frail and confused, a far cry from the 30-year-old predator who had committed murder. Defense attorneys would undoubtedly argue that prosecuting an elderly man for crimes committed nearly 5 decades earlier served no useful purpose. But Morris knew that justice had no expiration date, that families deserved answers no matter how long they had to wait, and that society had an obligation to hold killers accountable regardless of how successfully they had hidden their crimes. The neighbor's interview played out in Mrs. Patterson's living room, where the elderly woman sat surrounded by decades of memories that had suddenly taken on sinister new meaning. The television crew had set up their cameras carefully, framing the shot to show the window through which Mrs. Patterson had watched Terrence Miller tend his garden, shovel snow, and live what appeared to be an exemplary life. "He was such a quiet man," Mrs. Patterson told the reporter, her voice still shaking with disbelief. "Always kept his yard neat, never caused any trouble. When my husband died 5 years ago, Terry was one of the first people to offer help. He brought casseroles, fixed my leaking faucet, never asked for anything in return." The reporter pressed gently for details about Miller's behavior, any signs that might have suggested the darkness he carried within him. But Mrs. Patterson shook her head, genuinely bewildered by the revelation that her helpful neighbor had been a killer. "If you had told me last week that Terry Miller had murdered someone, I would have laughed at you," she said. "He helped organize the neighborhood watch program. He volunteered at the church food bank. When the Jenkins boy broke his arm playing baseball, Terry drove him to the hospital because his parents weren't home." Similar interviews played out across Snohomish County as reporters tracked down anyone who had known Miller over the decades. The portrait that emerged was of a man who had perfected the art of hiding in plain sight. Friendly but not intrusive, helpful but not overly familiar, the kind of neighbor who blended seamlessly into the background of suburban life. At the Methodist church where Miller had attended services for 23 years, Pastor Williams struggled to reconcile the man he knew with the charges against him. Miller had served on committees, helped with church maintenance, and donated regularly to the building fund. Nothing in his behavior had ever suggested capacity for violence. The community's reaction reflected a fundamental horror that went beyond the specific crime. The realization that evil could wear such an ordinary mask that the person next door might harbor secrets too terrible to imagine. The fresh flowers at Jody's grave had become a weekly ritual for her sister Margaret, who still made the 20-minute drive from her home every Saturday morning, 47 years after saying goodbye to the person who had been her closest friend and confidant. But today felt different. Today carried the weight of approaching closure, the knowledge that after decades of questions, they might finally have answers. Margaret knelt beside the gravestone, arranging white roses with the same careful attention she had given them for nearly 5 decades. The cemetery had grown around Jody's resting place, new sections added as the years passed, but her sister's grave remained in the original section, where weathered monuments marked the resting places of Snohomish County's earliest families. "We got him, Jody," Margaret whispered, her words carried away by the autumn wind that rustled through the maple trees overhead. "After all these years, we finally got him." The months leading up to Miller's trial had been emotionally exhausting for the surviving family members. Police interviews had forced them to relive the worst days of their lives, while media attention had brought unwanted scrutiny to their private grief. Margaret had become the family's reluctant spokesperson, the one who spoke to reporters and attended court hearings while her aging parents tried to protect themselves from further heartbreak. The prospect of facing Miller in court filled Margaret with conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to look into the eyes of the man who had destroyed her family to understand what kind of person could murder an innocent young woman. But another part of her feared that seeing Miller might somehow humanize him, make him seem less like the monster she had imagined and more like the frail old man he had become. The trial preparations had been thorough but difficult. Prosecutors had warned the family that defense attorneys might try to portray Miller as a confused old man who posed no threat to society, arguing that prosecuting him served no useful purpose after so much time had passed. But Margaret knew better. Justice didn't age out, and families didn't stop needing answers just because years had passed. Tomorrow's trial would finally give them what they had sought for 47 years. The suicide note was brief and unrevealing, typed on plain white paper in the careful block letters of a man who had spent decades concealing his true nature even from himself. "I can't face what's coming," Miller had written. "I'm sorry for the pain I've caused." He signed it simply T. Miller, as if even in death he couldn't bring himself to admit the full scope of his crimes. Detective Walsh found Miller's body in his garage on the morning of February 14, 2020, exactly 48 hours before jury selection was scheduled to begin. Miller had used a length of rope and a stepladder, choosing a method that ensured there would be no possibility of rescue or resuscitation. His final act was as carefully planned as everything else in his orderly, deceptive life. The timing felt like one last act of cruelty to the Loomis family, who had spent months preparing themselves emotionally for the trial that would finally provide answers and closure. Margaret had planned to testify about her sister's life, to ensure that jurors understood Jody as more than just a victim. Mrs. Loomis, now 89 and in fragile health, had steeled herself to attend every day of proceedings, determined to see justice served before her own time ran out. Miller's death changed everything and nothing. The legal case died with him. There could be no conviction of a dead man, no formal declaration of guilt, no moment when a judge's gavel would finally close the book on 48 years of waiting. The family would never have their day in court, never see Miller held accountable for his actions, never get the satisfaction of watching him sentenced for his crimes. But the evidence remained conclusive. The DNA didn't disappear because Miller had. The scientific proof that he had killed Jody Loomis was as solid in death as it had been in life. Law enforcement officials immediately scheduled a press conference to discuss the case's resolution, understanding that the public and the family deserved to know that justice had been served, even if it hadn't arrived in the courtroom they had anticipated. Miller had cheated the justice system one final time, but he couldn't cheat the truth. The press conference podium stood in the main briefing room of the Snohomish County Sheriff's Department, surrounded by cameras and reporters who had gathered to hear the official conclusion of one of the county's oldest unsolved cases. Sheriff Rebecca Thompson approached the microphone with the solemnity appropriate to an announcement that would finally provide answers to a family that had waited 48 years for them. "While we are disappointed that Terrence Miller's death has prevented a trial from taking place," Sheriff Thompson began, "I want to be absolutely clear about the evidence in this case. The DNA analysis conducted by our forensic experts conclusively links Mr. Miller to the 1972 murder of Jody Loomis. The probability that this genetic material came from anyone other than Miller is less than 1 in several billion. The sheriff outlined the investigation that had led to Miller's identification, praising the work of Detective Walsh, forensic genealogist Maria Santos, and the laboratory technicians who had coaxed genetic profiles from evidence that had waited decades for the right technology to unlock its secrets. She emphasized that modern forensic science had provided the answers that 1,970 investigative techniques could not deliver. The Loomis family has shown extraordinary patience and faith in our justice system over the past 48 years, Thompson continued. While Mr. Miller's suicide has denied them the courtroom proceedings they deserved, I hope they can find some measure of peace in knowing that we have definitively identified their daughter's killer. The questions from reporters focused on the investigation's timeline, the role of genetic genealogy in solving cold cases, and the broader implications for other unsolved crimes from the same era. Thompson fielded each inquiry professionally, but her voice carried an undertone of frustration that Miller had escaped formal justice through his final, selfish act. The press conference concluded with Thompson's promise that the sheriff's department would continue pursuing other cold cases using the same techniques that had identified Miller. Every family deserves answers, she said. Every victim deserves justice. Time may pass, but our commitment to solving these cases will never waver. The official case file would be marked cleared by death of suspect, a bureaucratic notation that could never fully capture the decades of grief, investigation, and ultimate resolution that the phrase represented. The framed photograph of Jody that Mrs. Loomis held during her family's press conference showed a young woman frozen in time. 20 years old forever, her blonde hair catching sunlight, her smile bright with possibilities that would never be fulfilled. Margaret sat beside her mother, providing physical support for the woman who had carried a mother's grief for 48 years while waiting for answers that had almost never come. "We want to thank everyone who never gave up on finding Jody's killer," Mrs. Loomis said, her voice stronger than her frail appearance suggested. Detective Morrison, who worked so hard in those early years. Detective Walsh, who brought new technology to old evidence. All the scientists and genealogists who helped identify this man. The family statement was careful and measured, reflecting legal advice and their own emotional exhaustion after decades of living with uncertainty. They expressed gratitude for the identification of Miller while acknowledging their disappointment that he had escaped accountability through suicide. "We always hoped we would see Jody's killer face justice in a courtroom," Margaret added. "That didn't happen, but we know who he was, and we know he can never hurt anyone else. That has to be enough." The questions from reporters were respectful but probing. How did it feel to finally have answers? Did they forgive Miller? What would they say to other families waiting for resolution of their own cold cases? Loomis answered with the dignity of someone who had spent decades learning to live with unimaginable loss. "Forgiveness is between him and God now," she said. "I won't waste whatever time I have left hating someone who's already gone. I'd rather remember my daughter and be grateful that the truth finally came out." The family declined to discuss their private conversations about the case, but their public statements reflected a complex mixture of relief, disappointment, and resignation. They had waited nearly 5 decades for this moment, but it hadn't arrived in the form they had imagined or hoped for. As the press conference ended, Mrs. Loomis clutched Jody's photograph closer to her chest, as if holding onto the last physical connection to the daughter whose story had finally reached its conclusion. The DNA database that had helped solve Jody's case represented a revolution in criminal justice that extended far beyond a single 48-year-old murder in rural Washington. Across the country, similar success stories were making headlines as genetic genealogy transformed cold cases from forgotten files into active investigations with real hope for resolution. In California, the Golden State Killer had been identified and convicted using the same techniques that had exposed Terrence Miller. In Indiana, the 1988 murder of April Tinsley was finally solved when DNA led investigators to John Miller, no relation to Terrence. In Colorado, the 1984 murder of Jonelle Matthews was resolved when genetic genealogy identified Stephen Pankey as the killer. Each success generated new interest from families who had never given up hope that their loved one's case might someday be solved. Police departments across the nation began reviewing their cold case files, identifying which investigations might benefit from modern forensic genealogy techniques. The technology wasn't without controversy. Privacy advocates worried about the implications of using consumer DNA databases for criminal investigation, arguing that people who submitted genetic material for ancestry research hadn't consented to participate in law enforcement activities. Some genealogy companies restricted police access to their databases, while others cooperated fully with investigations. But for families like the Loomises, these philosophical debates were secondary to the practical reality that science had finally provided answers to questions that had haunted them for decades. The moral calculus seemed clear. If surrendering some privacy could prevent other families from enduring decades of uncertainty, most people considered it a worthwhile trade. Detective Walsh had begun working with other jurisdictions to share information about successful genetic genealogy techniques. She lectured at law enforcement conferences, consulted on difficult cases, and served as an advocate for families who deserve better from their justice system. The Loomis case had become a template for how modern science could reach back through time to solve crimes that previous generations of investigators had found unsolvable. It offered hope to families who had almost given up and reminded everyone that sometimes justice delayed is not justice denied. The fresh flowers that appeared weekly at Jody's graveside came from many hands now, family members who had never forgotten, friends who still remembered her laugh, and strangers who had followed her story through news reports and found themselves touched by the long journey toward justice. The small cemetery had become an unexpected shrine to the power of persistence, the triumph of science over secrecy, and the enduring love of those who refused to let the murdered be forgotten. Margaret continued her Saturday morning visits, but she was no longer alone in her vigil. Other families dealing with unsolved cases sometimes sometimes came to Jodie's grave, drawing inspiration from a story that proved cold cases could be solved, that killers could be identified, that truth could survive even decades of concealment. The headstone itself had been supplemented by a small garden that church volunteers maintained, its seasonal flowers creating a living memorial that changed with the years but never disappeared. Spring brought daffodils and tulips, summer added roses and lilies, autumn featured chrysanthemums and asters, while winter's bare branches were decorated with evergreen wreaths that promised renewal would come again. On this particular morning, as autumn painted the maple trees in shades of gold and red, Margaret placed white roses beside the headstone and spoke quietly to her sister about the grandchildren Jodie would never meet, the life she never got to live, and the justice that had finally arrived, imperfect but real. "You can rest now," Margaret whispered, her words carried away by a breeze that seemed to rise from the earth itself. "Everyone knows the truth. Everyone knows you mattered." The narrator's voice, which had guided this story through 48 years of investigation, grief, and ultimate resolution, offered final thoughts on the nature of justice and memory. Truth, the voice reflected, doesn't erase pain. It transforms it into something bearable, something that honors rather than destroys. Light doesn't eliminate darkness, but it reveals what was hidden and makes healing possible. As the camera lingered on Jodie's gravestone for the final time, the screen slowly faded to black, leaving viewers with the image of a young woman who had been murdered but not forgotten, whose story had ended in justice, delayed but not denied.